Section, I'm just going to show you a visual recap of the slides that talk about pivot table basics. This will be about how to set up a pivot table. So the first thing and most important thing is that your data is set up in a way that supports pivot table functionality. So what I mean by that is that your data needs to be set up in columns so that it has headers, and all the information that's located under each header supports that specific header. So like in column B here, we have quarter, and all the data that would be under that column is information about the quarter. So like this first record is Q4 2019. So I know that that record is specifically going to speak about information from fourth quarter in the year of 2019. Column C is just the year by itself. It's purely just, you can go there and figure out which year you're in with no problem whatsoever, and that record will correspond to that year. Column D is total retail sales, and under this one, every record that falls underneath it will be information about retail sales. In column E, same thing as D, all the information under it will be about e-commerce sales. So I can trust that the data underneath this won't change, and that's what you need for pivot tables to be effective. The data integrity has to be good. Now the second thing I always do, especially since I use a lot of pivot tables for as like a data dump to support reporting in the background, instead of just using the range of my data as it is today, I always choose to use all the rows that support those columns. And the reason I do this is because most people end up using this as kind of a data dump, or they have to update their records basically every week, every month, every day, depending on what the frequency of your reporting is. And if you do this up front, then when you go in to copy and paste your new data in here, you don't have to update your data range each and every single time, which, if you do that, can create human error because of the fact that you may forget to do it. So if you do it this way the first time, you never have to go back through and update your data range. So now that we have it highlighted, the next thing you'd have to do a pivot table is go up here to the Insert tab, up here at this Insert tab, click on it, and then within the ribbon, the very first one here is pivot tables. So if you click on here, you'll get a create pivot table box that will show up. And what's highlighted in here is really just the data range that I just explained to you, and it holds all the data from columns A to E in every row within those columns. That's what this means. We're going to click OK now, and it'll come up with a new sheet. This new sheet is where you'll create the pivot table, and on this sheet you'll see a box over here, and then you'll see basically your canvas over here for what you're going to use, or not what you're going to use, what you're going to see is the output of the actions you take over here. So this box and this canvas are interconnected. So let's go over to the box. This is where you have your pivot table fields. Now these pivot table fields are the selections that you'll use to populate and design your pivot table. So if you look over here, you'll see period, quarter, year, total retail sales, e-commerce. If you go back to our original data and you look at the headers of our original data, you'll see that they correspond. Period, quarter, year, total retail sales, e-commerce. So whatever's over there is what you'll see over here. But you can actually have more selections in here than you have in your original data. And we'll get to that later on. Now, the next thing is you have filters. Filters basically allows the removal of unnecessary records from analysis that do not support the question trying to be answered. Columns creates vertical headers to assist in data organization. Rows creates horizontal headers to assist in displaying detail about records. The values, this is where the numeric data is supposed to go. And down here at the for layout, update tells the table to not make any updates to calculations or layout until you give permission. Now, like I said before, you only use this if you have this box checked. If you don't do that, then whenever you make an adjustment, your data will automatically update. Alright, so let's show some of these in action. Okay, so we have filters. You don't necessarily have to have something in filters, but just for these purposes, we'll put something in there. So we're going to sit there and put in year. Pretty easy. And what you'll see is it's creating your pivot table now. This has become your filter. The next thing we'll do is we'll add something into, let's say, quarter, or add a quarter into rows. Now you have data going up and down, and you'll see that it is separated from the filter. There's a row in between. It's separated. So it clearly defines what the information is. Now we'll go over here to values, and we'll add in, let's just add in total retail sales. Now you'll see in this column, this record is the information that supports Q1 of 2000 total sum of total retail sales. And we can put e-commerce in there. Same difference. Now you have two, and it gives all the data by quarter for all years for e-commerce. Now, you've seen that when I had added a second one, this sum of values populated. If I take it away, it's no longer there. Basically, it's just saying that you have multiple records, and it's telling you that it's giving you additional functionality. So if I put that back in, now it's saying that I have more functionality, but now I've given it a header name. So basically, I probably should have just said that this guarantees that you always have some kind of header for organizing your data vertically. Can't speak. Alright, so now we have our pivot table designed. Now, we can also adjust this and say, hey, we don't want our quarters to go up and down, we want them to go left and right. So we can sit here and take quarter, move it up here to columns, and then take value, move it down here to rows, and now we see that our layout has changed, and our data is now presented in a different format and fashion. But this is why I say that I like pivot tables, because of the data flexibility and the ease of changing layouts and changing the way you analyze your information. Now let's say that we want to, as another example, let's say we don't want to see quarters, but we want to see year. Well, again, like I said, pivot tables are very agile and they're flexible. So I can literally take the quarter out of here, move it over to my filters, and then move the filter that I had in there, year, over to columns. Now I've changed the information within my pivot table that easily, which is something you can't normally do with just regular spreadsheets. So when you have a spreadsheet of data within a workbook, the data, which you can see here from our original data, it's set up in one way. You have to analyze it that way, and you have to add the additional columns on it by analyzation of that way. Well, on a spreadsheet, I just showed you, it's completely flexible. So say I don't want to have my years up top because it makes things go too far out. I can flip it down the bottom again and move the values up here. Now it's in a way that looks more reasonable to the eyes and it's more appealing, and you can just see it better. And again, it makes it easy. Alright, now I told you that if you use this bottom piece of defer layout, it can, well, defer layout, it basically, like I said, tells the table not to make any updates or calculations until you give permission. Well, I'll show you. So you saw just a minute ago that anytime I move something around, it automatically adjusts the layout of the pivot table immediately. I don't have to wait, it just moves it. But when you click defer layout, if I move this up to here, nothing happens. If I move this down here, nothing happens. If I move this over here, nothing happens. If I get rid of this, nothing happens. It's because I've checked the defer layout update button. So if I want to make this again, years down here, quarters up there, and I want to I remove my e-commerce. Now I have to, and while it's still clicked, I got to push update. And once I press update, it's going to change all the data in here. It's going to recalculate because it's going to take off the sum of e-commerce. It's going to remove the quarters, put them up top, and put the years down at the bottom. But none of that's happened up to this point because we have this checked. We told it not to do anything until we give it permission. Now we're going to give it permission by pushing update. Now everything has been updated. Now I use this one very sparingly. I use defer layout when I'm trying to do stuff that's a little more complex, or I have multiple pivot tables on a page, and pivot tables will not overlap other pivot tables. So if you tell it to do something and it adds more rows than you have sitting in between this pivot table, and let's say we'll copy this down, and your next pivot table, so in this case we have 4 rows. If I was to go up here and say I want to put quarter down here, well, I can't do it because it says a pivot table report cannot overlap another pivot table report. Remember that the quarters, and we'll do it on the bottom one so you can see why, quarters have a lot more records. So I can't fit all of these records into 4 rows. So it's basically coming up with an error message saying you're doing some operation that is not allowed because a pivot table cannot overlap another pivot table. So in deferred layout, it allows me to sit there and say, okay, I want to make all my adjustments so that I can make sure this doesn't happen. So if I know that I'm going to put quarter up here instead of years, I've got to go down here, add in more rows, go back to my pivot table. Let's put our defer layout up here, switch it up, click update. Oh, still don't have enough rows in there, so now I gotta go back through, add a few more, back in, activate it. Layout, switch these two. Now click update, and now I have enough room between my top pivot and my bottom pivot to allow the operation to function. To me, that's one of the best uses of defer layout. Alright, so now we're going to get rid of this bottom pivot table, but as you can see, you can have multiple pivot tables in one page. You can have them side by side, up and down, underneath each other. You can have them, it's not a big deal. So, whoops, we're going to get rid of this one. And when you get rid of it, make sure you capture everything that's in the pivot table, including the filters. Alright. So now we have our original pivot table here. This is, everything that I've showed you is basically the basics of creating a pivot table. It's real easy. You have a question that you want to answer. You set your data up to answer that question. Your canvas creates the output. It's flexible, agile, and fast on putting the information the way that you want to see it.